She caught him mid-sentence, his hand over another woman's glove, promising her the one thing that belonged to no one but a wife. The crest that rode upon the doors of the ducal carriage, the very symbol stitched into silk cushions and stamped into wax seals since before either of them had been born. She was already gone from the doorway, already halfway down the corridor, already deciding that by sunrise there would be nothing left on those carriage doors for his mistress to admire. If you have ever stood in a doorway and heard the exact moment your whole life became a lie, you already know why she didn't scream, why she didn't cry, why she simply turned and walked toward the stables in the dark. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe if you believe some women get even instead of getting mad, and stay until the end, because what she did to that carriage was only the first thing she did that night, and it was nowhere near the worst. Before she was a duchess, she was nobody in particular, which was precisely the way the old duke's family liked her, because nobody in particular could be married off to a second son with no title and no inheritance and no expectation of ever marrying, and nobody would ever ask why. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she had grown up in a grey stone house at the edge of a parish so small it did not appear on most maps, the daughter of a country physician who had spent his modest fortune on other people's fevers and broken bones and died owing more than he owned. She had been raised on Latin and arithmetic, and the particular kind of pride that comes from having nothing and refusing to apologize for it. And when her father died and left her with a leaking roof and a stack of unpaid accounts, she had done what any sensible woman in her position did. She had accepted the first respectable offer that came, and the offer had come, strangely enough, from a Whitmore, though not the Whitmore anyone in society cared to gossip about. His name was Frederick, and he was the younger son of the Duke of Ashcombe, a title so old it had its own chapter in county histories, and Frederick had never expected to inherit anything, least of all a dukedom, because his elder brother Charles was healthy and married, and already the father of two sons who stood between Frederick and any real consequence. Frederick had married Eleanor quietly, without fanfare, in a country chapel with exactly 4 witnesses, because he liked her calm eyes and her refusal to flatter him, and because in his own words he had grown tired of women who wanted him for what he might someday become. They had 5 years of a marriage that was not passionate but was, in its own small way, kind. 5 years in a modest manor house on the edge of the Ashcombe estate. 5 years of Eleanor learning to run a household on a second son's allowance, and to love a man who loved her back in a quiet, undemonstrative fashion that she told herself was enough. Then came the fever that swept through the main house in a single terrible winter, and it took Charles first, and then, within the fortnight, both of his young sons and the old Duke himself, already frail, did not survive the grief of burying 3 generations in a single season. Frederick, who had spent his whole life as a spare, found himself the 9th Duke of Ashcombe before the ground had properly settled over his brother's grave, and Eleanor, who had spent her whole life as nobody in particular, found herself a duchess before she had even finished mourning people she had genuinely loved. The transformation did not suit either of them the way people imagined it would. Frederick grew distant almost overnight, buried beneath ledgers and land disputes and the crushing unfamiliar weight of a title he had never trained for, a man drowning quietly in obligations, while everyone around him assumed he was simply becoming colder, prouder, more like his father. Eleanor, for her part, discovered that a title did not erase what people already believed about her. The dowager aunts and the county matrons who had once ignored her as an inconsequential second son's wife now examined her with a different, sharper cruelty, whispering behind fans that the new Duchess had married beneath her own good fortune, that she carried herself like a physician's daughter playing dress-up in someone else's jewels, that she would never learn to wear the Ashcombe name the way it deserved to be worn. Eleanor endured this the way she had endured everything else in her life, with a straight spine and a closed mouth, telling herself that Frederick's growing distance was grief and duty, and nothing more. That the coldness in his eyes when he looked at her was the coldness of a man carrying more weight. She told herself this for 2 years. She told herself this even as he began spending more evenings at his London club and fewer at their country table, even as his letters home grew shorter and his visits grew rarer, even as the servants began exchanging glances. It was into this widening silence that Lady Vivien Caro arrived, like a splinter finding the one soft place in old wood. Vivien was the widow of a minor viscount, beautiful in the sharp, calculated way of a woman who had spent years learning exactly which angle of her chin caught candlelight most flatteringly. And she arrived in London society with a story of tragic widowhood and modest means that made every hostess in 3 counties eager to seat her beside eligible men at dinner. She was clever in a manner Eleanor would later come to understand was not cleverness at all, but a kind of patient predatory calculation, the sort of intelligence that spent itself entirely on the question of how to take what belonged to other people. She met Frederick at a card party in his 4th month of avoiding his own wife, and she did what she had apparently done to at least 2 other titled men before him, which was to become, almost overnight, indispensable to his loneliness. She laughed at his jokes in a way that suggested she found him fascinating rather than merely dutiful. She asked him questions about his estate management that made him feel, for the first time in 2 exhausting years, like a competent man rather than a boy playing at his father's job. She never once mentioned his brother's death or his father's shadow or the crushing comparison that hung over every room he entered, and in her presence Frederick began to remember what it felt like to be admired rather than merely endured. He told himself it was friendship. He told himself this for the better part of a year, right up until the evening he found himself standing in a private parlour of his own London townhouse, holding Vivien's gloved hand, promising her something no mistress had any right to be promised, which was a place, however unofficial, however whispered about, however carefully disguised, within the visible symbols of his family's name. The Carriage Crest was not a small thing. It had been carved into the family's carriage doors for 4 generations, a lion rampant beneath a laurel wreath, the same crest that appeared on the ducal seal, the same crest that announced to every servant, every tradesman, every stranger on every road in England, that the carriage rolling past belonged to the House of Ashcombe. It was not jewellery. It was not a house in town or an allowance, though Frederick had already quietly arranged both of those things for Vivien without his wife's knowledge. It was a public claim, and that was precisely why Vivien wanted it, because Vivien did not want secrecy. Vivien wanted the world to see her riding in a carriage stamped with a duke's own crest, and to draw its own conclusions about what that meant, because a woman who could not have the title wanted, at the very least, to be seen wearing its shadow. Eleanor had travelled up from the country that week for reasons that had nothing to do with suspicion. Frederick's man of business had sent word that certain estate papers required her signature as Duchess, a formality Frederick had been too occupied to attend to himself, and so she had come to the townhouse unannounced, tired from the road, expecting an ordinary evening of quiet correspondence before returning home the following day. She had not expected to hear her husband's voice drifting from the small parlour at the end of the hall, low and warm in a register she had not heard directed at her in over a year, and she had not expected, upon pausing outside the half-open door, to hear him tell another woman that he would see to it that by the end of the month there would be a crest upon her own private carriage. Subtle enough not to invite scandal, but unmistakable enough that anyone who knew the Ashcombe Arms would recognize precisely whose protection she rode beneath. Eleanor did not make a sound. She had spent her whole life learning the particular discipline of not making a sound when the ground shifted beneath her, first as a physician's daughter watching patients die despite her father's best efforts, then as a second son's wife absorbing the small cruelties of relatives who thought her beneath them. And she called upon that same discipline now, standing in a darkened hallway, while her husband promised a stranger the one symbol that was supposed to belong entirely and only to his wife. She did not weep. She did not confront him in that parlor, though every instinct in her body screamed to fling the door open and demand an explanation. She understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent a lifetime being underestimated. That confrontation in that moment would accomplish nothing except giving Frederick the chance to explain, to soften, to beg for time, and Eleanor did not want an explanation. She wanted, in that instant, only one thing, which was to make certain that whatever Frederick had promised, Vivien Caro would never, ever be delivered. She turned from the doorway and walked back down the corridor, with the same measured steps she had used her entire life to disguise the earthquakes happening beneath her feet, and she did not go to her bedchamber. She went instead to find Hobbs. Hobbs had been the Ashcombe head coachman for 31 years, a barrel-chested man with a face like weathered oak who had driven 3 generations of the family through births, weddings, and funerals, and who had, in the 2 years since Frederick's ascension, developed a quiet, unspoken loyalty to Eleanor that neither of them had ever needed to discuss aloud. He found her waiting for him in the mews behind the townhouse at nearly midnight, her cloak drawn tight against the cold, her face unreadable in the lantern light. And when she told him what she required, he did not ask why, though his jaw tightened in a way that told her he had already guessed. She wanted the crest removed from every carriage door in the family's possession, town and country both, by morning. Not painted over, not disguised, scraped clean, sanded down, the wood beneath refinished so thoroughly that no trace of the lion and laurel would remain, and in its place she wanted nothing at all, no crest, no symbol, no mark of any kind, until she herself gave instruction otherwise. Hobbs looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light, and then he simply nodded, and by 1 in the morning he had roused 2 grooms and a carpenter who owed him a favor, and by 4 the work had begun in the cold dark of the mews, careful hands stripping away 4 generations of family pride from every carriage the Duke owned. Because his wife had decided in the space of a single overheard sentence that if her husband intended to make promises about that crest to another woman, he would find he had nothing left to promise. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of the guest room he had taken, rather than share the marital bedchamber, listening to the distant scrape of tools against wood, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was not an act of jealousy. If Frederick believed the crest was his to give away, he was mistaken, and she intended, before the sun rose, to correct that mistake in the only language a man like him would be forced to understand immediately, which was the visible, undeniable absence of the thing itself. By dawn, the carriage doors stood bare, the wood beneath sanded smooth and freshly oiled, no trace remaining of the lion rampant or the laurel wreath, and when Frederick came down to the mews at 7 that morning, still unaware of what his wife had witnessed the night before, still imagining his secret entirely intact, he stopped so abruptly that Hobbs, standing nearby with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, nearly smiled despite himself. Frederick stared at the bare wood for a long moment before he found his voice, and when he did, it came out thinner than he intended. He asked Hobbs what in God's name had happened to the family carriages, and Hobbs, who had served 3 dukes and buried none of his opinions, told him with perfect composure that her Grace had given the order herself, personally, sometime after midnight, and that she had specified she would explain her reasoning to him directly. Frederick found Eleanor in the small breakfast room an hour later, already dressed, already composed, already pouring tea with hands that did not shake, though she had not slept a single hour. He asked her, with the particular sharpness of a man who suspects he is in trouble, but does not yet know why, what possible reason she could have had for defacing family property that had stood unchanged for 4 generations. Eleanor set down the teapot with great care and looked at him directly, and she told him, in a voice so even it frightened him more than shouting would have, that she had overheard every word of his conversation with Lady Caro the previous evening, and that she had decided, upon reflection, that a crest he was willing to promise to his mistress was clearly a crest he no longer valued, and so she had simply relieved him of the burden of it. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the tea went cold in both their cups. Frederick's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, surprise, denial forming and dying on his lips before he could voice it, and finally something that looked, to Eleanor's private and bitter satisfaction, like genuine shame. He did not deny the conversation. He could not, because he understood immediately that denial would only compound whatever damage had already been done, and so instead he attempted the oldest defense available to a guilty man, which was to explain that it had meant nothing, that Vivien was merely a friend, that the promise had been made carelessly, and did not reflect any true intention toward impropriety. Eleanor listened to the entire explanation without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him a single question, quietly, without heat. She asked him whether he had, in fact, already secured a house in town for Lady Caro's use, and whether he had, in fact, already arranged a private allowance for her from the estate accounts. Frederick's silence answered before his words could, and Eleanor rose from the table, then leaving her tea untouched, and told him that she would be returning to the country that same afternoon, and that he was welcome to remain in London to attend to whatever arrangements he felt required his personal attention, but that she would thank him not to expect her at his side for any social engagement, public or private, until he had resolved, to her satisfaction, precisely what kind of husband he intended to be. She left the townhouse that afternoon in a hired carriage, rather than the family conveyance, unwilling to ride even briefly in a vehicle that had so recently carried the shadow of his infidelity, and Frederick watched her go from an upstairs window with a hollow, sinking feeling in his chest that he did not yet have the vocabulary to name as fear, because Frederick Whitmore, 9th Duke of Ashcombe, had spent his entire adult life assuming that whatever mistakes he made, his wife's quiet endurance would absorb them, the way it had absorbed every slight and every silence for the whole of their marriage, and it had not once occurred to him, or that the woman who possessed it might, on the night that limit was reached, respond not with tears, but with a decision so swift and so total that 4 generations of family pride lay stripped from his carriage doors before he had even finished his breakfast. What Frederick did not know, and would not learn for some weeks, was that Eleanor's quiet departure from London was not merely wounded retreat. It was the beginning of an investigation she had already, in the small hours of that terrible night, begun to conduct in her own mind, because a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated learns to notice things that other people overlook, and Eleanor had noticed in the weeks leading up to that overheard conversation a great many small irregularities she had previously dismissed as none of her concern. She had noticed that the estate steward, a man named Josiah Renwick, who had served the family for a decade and had inherited his position from his own father before him, had grown noticeably evasive whenever she asked simple questions about quarterly expenditures. She had noticed that certain tenant farms reported declining yields on paper, while the market prices for their goods had risen steadily for 2 years running, an arithmetic that did not sensibly reconcile. She had noticed that Renwick had grown close, in recent months, to a London solicitor named Gideon Marsh, a man whose name appeared with increasing frequency on estate correspondence, despite having no obvious connection to Ashcombe affairs. And she had noticed, though she had not yet permitted herself to draw the conclusion fully into the light, that Vivien Caro's late husband, the minor viscount, had done business before his death with that very same Gideon Marsh. Eleanor arrived back at the country estate, not as a wounded wife retreating to lick her injuries, but as a duchess who had finally decided to stop assuming her husband's distraction was simply grief, and to start asking, with the same methodical patience her physician father had once applied to a difficult diagnosis, what exactly had been happening beneath the surface of her own household while she had been too polite, too dutiful, too willing to give everyone the benefit of every doubt to look closely enough to see it. She began quietly with the household accounts, spending her evenings by candlelight, comparing ledger entries against tenant reports. She requested directly rather than through Renwick's office, and within a fortnight she had found enough discrepancies to fill a small notebook, rents collected but never recorded, drapairs billed to the estate that tenants swore had never been performed, a pattern of numbers that, taken individually, might have been dismissed as clerical carelessness, but taken together painted a picture of systematic and deliberate theft that had likely been ongoing for years, quietly bleeding the estate of funds that should have gone toward tenant welfare and land improvement, and had instead vanished into accounts she could not yet trace. She enlisted, carefully and one at a time, the people she trusted most. Hobbs, who knew every road and every rumour for 20 miles in any direction, quietly asked questions among the other coachmen and grooms of neighbouring estates, and returned with word that Gideon Marsh had been seen, on more than one occasion, meeting privately with Renwick at a coaching inn well outside the village. At hours no legitimate estate business would require, Mrs. Fairweather, the housekeeper who had served the family even longer than Hobbs and who had never once in 30 years failed to notice which servants gossiped and which servants merely listened, brought Eleanor quiet word from the kitchen staff that Renwick had recently paid off a considerable personal debt in a single lump sum. A sum well beyond what his modest steward's salary could have provided. And there was young Thomas, the stable boy of perhaps 14, who idolized Frederick, with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who had grown up hearing stories of the old Duke's kindness, and desperately wanted to believe his successor deserved the same reputation, who came to Eleanor one afternoon with wide, frightened eyes to report that he had, quite by accident, overheard Renwick and a stranger arguing in the estate office about missing paperwork, about a ledger that needed to be, in the stranger's words, made to disappear before anyone came looking too closely. Piece by piece, across nearly 2 months of careful, patient work, conducted almost entirely without Frederick's knowledge, since he remained in London attempting, in his own clumsy fashion, to extricate himself from the entanglement with Vivien Caro, Eleanor assembled a case. Renwick had been systematically diverting estate funds for years, falsifying tenant records, skimming rents, and funneling the proceeds through Gideon Marsh, who had, it turned out, served as legal counsel not only to Renwick's private financial affairs, to the estate of Vivien Caro's late husband, whose own finances Eleanor discovered through a discreet inquiry to a solicitor in London she trusted, had been considerably more depleted at the time of his death than his widow had ever publicly admitted. It began to look, the longer Eleanor examined it, less like two separate scandals, and more like a single quiet conspiracy. Vivien Caro, left with far less than the fortune she had led society to believe she possessed, had needed a wealthy protector, and had found one in a grieving, guilt-ridden, lonely Duke. Renwick, meanwhile, had needed a way to continue his theft, undetected by a distracted master, and a Duke, thoroughly occupied by scandal and heartbreak, was a Duke unlikely to examine his own account books too closely. Whether Vivien and Renwick had ever directly coordinated their schemes, Eleanor could not yet prove, but the presence of Gideon Marsh threading through both matters was, to her physician's daughter, mind-trained since childhood, to distrust coincidence, evidence enough to warrant a public reckoning. She wrote to Frederick only once during those 2 months, a brief and businesslike letter informing him that she had uncovered irregularities in the estate accounts that required his immediate and personal attention upon his return, offering no further detail because she had learned precisely how far Renwick's reach extended into the household correspondence, and she trusted no letter that might pass through hands other than her own to carry the full truth safely. Frederick returned to the country estate in early autumn, arriving to find his wife changed in some quiet, fundamental way he could not immediately articulate, no longer the patient, absorbing presence he had grown accustomed to, but something sharper, more contained. A woman clearly operating according to some private design he had not been invited to observe. He had, in his weeks in London, finally and firmly ended whatever understanding had existed with Vivien Caro, informing her in a difficult but necessary conversation that he could not, in good conscience, continue an arrangement that had already cost him something he was only beginning to understand he could not afford to lose. And he arrived home prepared to make whatever apology and whatever amends his wife required, only to discover that Eleanor was no longer interested in relitigating his infidelity. She was interested in his steward. She presented her findings to him across 2 full evenings in his study, laying out ledgers and tenant statements, and Hobbes's quiet inquiries, and Mrs. Fairweather's kitchen gossip, and young Thomas's frightened testimony with the same methodical precision her father had once used to explain a diagnosis to a worried family. And Frederick, listening to the scope of what had been happening beneath his own roof for years, while he remained too absorbed in his own private miseries to notice, felt something in him harden into a resolve he had not possessed since his brother's death had first placed the dukedom on his unprepared shoulders. He agreed without hesitation that the matter required a public reckoning rather than a quiet dismissal, because a private dismissal would allow Renwick to simply relocate his schemes to another unsuspecting household, and would leave Vivien Caro free to seek her next wealthy protection unchallenged, and who had spent 2 months building a case for exactly this purpose, had already anticipated what form that reckoning should take. The Ashcombe estate hosted every autumn a harvest banquet that drew every significant family within 30 miles. Tenants and gentry alike gathered in the great hall to mark the close of the season, and it was Eleanor. One occasion each year where Renwick himself would stand before the assembled tenants to formally read the year's accounts aloud, a tradition dating back generations meant to demonstrate the transparency and good stewardship of the house. It was, she said, the perfect stage for the truth to be revealed before precisely the audience most harmed by Renwick's theft and most deserving of seeing justice done in the open. Frederick agreed, and, in the weeks that followed, husband and wife worked together for the first time in years with something resembling genuine partnership, quietly gathering additional evidence, securing the sworn testimony of 2 tenant families who had suffered directly under falsified rent increases. Through a London contact of Frederick's own, for a formal letter from the magistrate's office confirming that Gideon Marsh was already under separate and unrelated investigation for financial improprieties involving at least one other client's estate, a discovery that gave Eleanor's private suspicions. They invited, though neither said so aloud, to the other. Until the very week of the banquet, Vivien Caro herself, on the pretense of a general invitation, extended to families of standing throughout the county. An invitation Vivien, unaware that anything had been discovered, accepted with what Eleanor privately suspected was renewed hope that some lingering warmth might still be salvaged from Frederick, or, failing that the grand and well-attended gathering might present other opportunities for a woman in her particular financial predicament. The night of the harvest banquet arrived, cold and clear, the great hall of Ashcombe blazing with candlelight, long tables laden with the season's bounty, tenants in their good clothes seated alongside gentry in silk and lace, the entire county gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling that had witnessed 4 generations of Whitmore celebrations, would witness something rather different. Renwick stood at the appointed hour before the assembled company, ledger in hand, prepared to deliver the same rehearsed recitation of prosperous yields and satisfied tenants he had delivered for a decade, entirely unaware that the Duke and Duchess, seated at the high table, already possessed, in a locked drawer not 20 feet from where he stood, the true figures that would expose every falsified line he was about to read aloud. He had gotten no further than the Second Farm's report when Frederick rose from his seat, and the great hall fell into the particular hush that follows an unexpected interruption at a formal occasion, 300 faces turning as one toward the head of the table. Frederick spoke without raising his voice, which somehow made the words carry further than shouting would have, informing the assembled company that before Mr. Traer, Renwick continued, the Duke wished to correct certain figures that appeared to have been recorded in error, and he asked with perfect and devastating courtesy whether Mr. Renwick might care to explain why the tenant farms at Millbrook and Ashley Cross showed declining yields in the estate ledger, while the tenants themselves, several of whom sat in that very hall, had sworn statements confirming record harvests those same years. Renwick's face drained of colour in the candlelight, and he began, stammering, to suggest some clerical confusion, some honest oversight easily corrected. But Eleanor rose then, beside her husband, and the sight of the Duchess herself standing to speak silenced whatever murmur had begun to rise among the tables. She informed the hall, in the same calm and even voice she had used to inform her husband of his own infidelity months earlier, that she had spent the autumn personally examining the estate's accounts against tenant records, and that the discrepancies numbered not in the dozens but well into the hundreds of pounds diverted over a period of years, funds that should have repaired tenant roofs and replaced failing equipment, and instead had vanished into private accounts held under the name of a London solicitor, named Gideon Marsh, a name that she noted, drawing a folded letter from her sleeve and holding it aloft for the hall to see. Appeared in a formal notice from the county magistrate's office, confirming that same solicitor already stood under separate investigation for defrauding at least one other noble estate. The hall erupted into a low, rolling murmur of shock and outrage, tenants exchanging stunned glances, gentry leaning toward one another to whisper, and it was into this rising tumult that Vivien Caro, seated near the middle of the hall in a gown clearly chosen to draw admiring eyes, made the catastrophic error of rising from her own seat to declare, in a voice pitched for the whole room to hear, that she failed to see what any of this dreary estate business had to do with the evening's celebration. An interjection so poorly timed and so transparently self-serving that it drew every eye in the hall directly onto her, precisely the sort of scrutiny. Eleanor turned to face her fully then, and the hall, sensing the sudden shift in the air, fell utterly silent. Eleanor asked Lady Caro with perfect and terrible politeness whether she might explain her own late husband's prior business dealings with the very same Gideon Marsh now named in the magistrate's letter, and whether she might further explain how a widow of such reportedly modest means had managed, in recent months, to secure a private townhouse in London and an independent carriage, matters Eleanor understood to have been arranged through funds that did not, so far as any honest accounting could determine, originate from Lady Caro's own estate. Vivien's composure, so carefully constructed across years of practiced widowhood, cracked visibly in front of 300 witnesses. She attempted denial, then attempted indignation, then attempted to appeal directly to Frederick himself, turning toward the head table with an expression that had, in private, once moved him to foolish and generous promises, but Frederick, standing beside his wife before the assembled county, did not soften. He informed Lady Caro, in a voice that carried the particular finality of a man who has finally understood the difference between being flattered and being loved, that whatever arrangement had existed between them was permanently concluded, that he deeply regretted the pain his weakness had caused his wife, and that he would thank Lady Caro to make whatever explanations were required to the magistrate's office rather than to him. Renwick, seeing his co-conspirators collapse and understanding that his own position had become hopeless, attempted to flee the hall in the confusion, only to find his path blocked by Hobbs, who had anticipated precisely this possibility. Doy escorted the steward firmly to a side chamber to await the arrival of the magistrate's men who had, at Eleanor's careful advance arrangement, been waiting discreetly in the estate's outer courtyard for exactly this signal. The tenants who had suffered under Renwick's falsified accounts rose one after another in the minutes that followed to add their own testimony to what Eleanor had already presented, farmers and their wives standing before the entire county to describe the roofs that had never been repaired despite the rent collected for that purpose, the equipment that had broken down and never been replaced, the small grinding injustices that Renwick's decade of theft had quietly inflicted upon people with far less power to protest than a Duke and Duchess possessed, and the hall, which had begun the evening in celebration, ended it instead in a kind of communal, cathartic reckoning. An entire community watching justice arrive, not quietly through some distant courtroom, but directly, publicly, undeniably, in the same hall where the theft had for years been disguised as ordinary business. Vivien Caro left Ashcombe that same night, her carriage notably absent of any crest, real or imagined, disappearing down the drive before the last of the banquet guests had even finished their desserts, and she did not appear again in county society, her financial improprieties and her connection to Gideon Marsh's fraud becoming, within a matter of weeks, common enough knowledge that no respectable hostess in 3 counties would seat her at a dinner table again. Renwick was formally charged within the fortnight, his decade of theft laid bare through Eleanor's meticulous ledgers and the tenant testimonies that had followed, and Gideon Marsh, already under separate investigation, found his existing troubles considerably compounded by his connection to the Ashcombe affair, the combined weight of evidence from 2 noble estates proving more than sufficient to see him disbarred and imprisoned within the year. In the weeks that followed the banquet, the Ashcombe household settled into a quiet that felt for the first time in over 2 years genuinely peaceful rather than merely absent of open conflict. Frederick, humbled by the full scope of what his distraction and his weakness had nearly cost, both his marriage and his tenants' welfare, alike began attending to his estate duties with a diligence he had not shown since first inheriting the title, learning at last to be a duke in more than name. He came to her one evening in early winter in the small parlour of the country house rather than any grand chamber, and he did not attempt grand speeches or elaborate apologies, understanding by now that Eleanor had little patience remaining for anything but plain truth. He told her simply that he had spent the autumn learning that he had married a woman considerably stronger and considerably more capable than he had ever properly appreciated, that he had mistaken her patience for weakness and her quiet for indifference, and that he understood now with a clarity that shamed him, that the crest she had ordered, stripped from every carriage in his possession, had been, in its way, the truest and most honest thing to happen in their marriage in over a year, because it had forced him to finally see what he stood to lose. Eleanor listened to him without interrupting, the way she had listened to Renwick's accounts and Vivien's denials, weighing his words with the same careful attention. And when he finished, she told him that she did not require grand declarations, only consistency. Only the same steady presence he had shown her in the first 5 years of their marriage before a title and a stranger's flattery had turned his head, and Frederick promised her that consistency, and in the months that followed, he kept that promise in the small daily ways that mattered more than any single grand gesture could have. The hours he spent learning tenant names and estate matters. In the evenings he chose her company over any distant club or distraction. In the quiet way he began, gradually, to earn back the trust his weakness had nearly destroyed. The Carriage Crest was eventually restored, carved fresh into new wood by the estate's own carpenter the following spring. The lion rampant and laurel wreath returned to their rightful place upon the doors, but Eleanor insisted on being present for the carving herself this time, standing in the mews to watch each stroke of the tool as the family symbols slowly re-emerged, because she wanted, she told Hobbs quietly as they watched together, to know exactly what it looked like when something precious was rebuilt rather than merely assumed. To understand the difference between a crest inherited without thought and a crest earned back through the slow, deliberate work of actually deserving it. The tenants of Ashcombe in the years that followed told the story of that harvest banquet, often embellishing it slightly with each retelling as such stories tend to grow, until the tale of the young Duchess who had scraped the family crest from her own carriage doors overnight exposed a decade of theft before the assembled county became something of local legend, told to children as an example of what quiet intelligence and patient courage could accomplish, even in a world inclined to underestimate a woman who had once been nobody in particular. Eleanor herself never much cared for the embellished versions of the story, preferring the plain truth of it, that she had simply refused to let a promise made in secret become a promise kept, that she had done the careful, unglamorous work of gathering evidence rather than settling for suspicion, and that in the end, the same instinct that had once made her scrape a crest from bare wood in the middle of a cold night had also been the instinct that finally, publicly, restored justice to the people who had been quietly wronged far longer and far more severely than she had. Frederick, for his part, kept a small, unremarkable habit for the rest of his life, one that Eleanor noticed but never remarked upon directly, which was that every single time he passed the family carriage, he would glance, briefly and almost unconsciously, at the crest upon its doors, as though reassuring himself that it remained exactly where it belonged. A quiet, private reminder of the single night he had nearly lost, through his own carelessness, the one woman who had ever loved him, without knowing or caring what he might someday become, and who had proven, in the harshest possible terms, that true worth was never a matter of birth or title or careless promises whispered in a private parlour, but of the steady, patient, unglamorous work of deserving what one had been given, a lesson the whole of Ashcombe learned that autumn, and one that Eleanor, quiet and unassuming and endlessly underestimated, had understood all along.